saw my daughter freezing outside on Thanksgiving Eve, while his family toasted champagne around the fireplace. That Thanksgiving, I lovingly prepared everything to visit my daughter. I thought it would be a night of reunions, hugs, and happy memories. But when I parked the car and saw my daughter outside, alone, shivering in the cold while laughter echoed inside the house, I understood that something was deeply wrong. The pain I felt at that moment transformed me forever. From then on, my life became a battle against the silence, omission, and appearances that covered the truth. All I wanted was to protect my daughter, and I discovered that, to do so, I would have to face an entire family, and even the justice system. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story to the end and comment from which city you are reading so I know how far this truth has reached. I got out of the car with my arms full of bags and my heart overflowing with anticipation. It was Thanksgiving Eve and I had planned this surprise visit for weeks. I bought Melody's favorite dishes, brought new toys for the small garden, and even an aromatic candle she loved as a child. I wanted to see her smile, hear her laugh, and feel that even among his family she had space to be happy. But as I approached the house, something started to feel wrong. The silence was heavy, dense like the grayish sky that threatened snow. No sounds of voices or music escaped through the windows, only the rustling of dry trees in the biting wind. The cold was so intense that I even wondered if I had the wrong day. Were they all sleeping? But it was almost 6 in the evening, and that house usually pulsed with movement at this time. I walked slower, feeling a tightening in my chest, trying to push away the anxiety that crept in unbidden. That's when I noticed the side door was ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. The garden was empty at first glance, but something made me stop halfway. A shiver ran down my spine and for an instant, I thought I heard a muffled sob coming from the side of the house. My hands started to sweat, despite the cold. I squinted, trying to see better through the icy mist that was beginning to form. And then I walked to the side of the house with short, careful steps, as if my body already knew something terrible awaited me there. But then I saw something that made my heart stop. She was sitting on the stone bench, curled up under a blanket too thin for that temperature. Melody, my daughter. Her skin looked paler than I remembered, and her eyes, lost somewhere in the dead garden, didn't recognize me immediately. Her hair disheveled, her hands trembling, her lips purple. My instinct was to run to her, but my body froze for a second, as if my brain needed time to accept that this was real. My daughter was freezing outside her own house, as if she were a stranger. From inside the house I started to hear muffled laughter, the clinking of toasting glasses, elegant ambient music. It was as if two worlds coexisted side by side, one of warmth and celebration, the other of abandonment and silence. I approached, finally, calling her name with a choked voice. She took a while to react, but then she looked up, and there were the tears. Without making a sound, she just let them fall, as if she no longer had the strength to cry out loud. Did they know she was there? I hugged my daughter as if I could warm her with my own heart. She curled up in my arms, and even without saying anything, I understood everything. This was not a case of neglect or distraction. It was deliberate. Melody sobbed softly, her face hidden on my shoulder, and I held her tighter, trying to protect her from the wind, the cold, the whole world if necessary. "I'm here," I whispered. "I'm here, my love." But before I could think of what to do, I heard something coming from the open living room window. It was a mocking female voice saying, "Melody is too sensitive, always has been. Drama is part of the package." Laughter accompanied the comment, and another voice, male, added, "One day she'll get over it or not. At least let her not spoil the night." My muscles tensed. The pain turned to fury in a matter of seconds. I wanted to enter that house, flip that dinner table, and shout that my daughter was a human being, not a decorative piece to be pushed into corners when inconvenient. And then I said 6 words that would change everything. No one ignores my daughter and gets away with it. The sound of tires on the wet road was almost comforting. After months without seeing Melody, I decided to make the trip as a surprise. I lovingly prepared everything. Pecan pie, embroidered napkins, an old photo album she adored. I wanted her to feel that, despite the distance, my love remained intact. I imagined her expression as she opened the door and saw me there, arms full and heart open. I was anxious to see what her first Thanksgiving as a wife would be like. While driving, I tried several times to call her, but the calls went straight to voicemail. I tried not to create stories in my head. Maybe she was busy with preparations. Evelyn always insisted on an impeccable dinner, and I knew Melody felt pressured. Still, a part of me wanted to hear her voice, just to confirm that everything was okay. Every mile seemed to carry an unanswered question. I clung to the idea that upon arrival everything would make sense. I wanted to believe that the silence was just part of a happy surprise. She didn't answer my calls, but I thought it was a surprise. It was at the city entrance that the red lights of the police car flashed behind me. My heart raced as I slowed down, confused. I pulled over, already imagining that I had exceeded the speed limit. As the officer approached the window, I noticed something familiar in his eyes. It was Jake Brown, a former student, now in uniform, a more serious demeanor, and a look that didn't hide his surprise. He smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. There was an unease in the air, something that made me hold my breath. "Professor Mary? It's a pleasure to see you here," he said, trying to sound light. I responded gently, explaining the reason for my trip. He made some comment about safe driving, but before releasing me, his eyes hesitated for an extra second. It was then that I felt it. He knew something. Something that perhaps involved my daughter. The silence that settled between us was heavier than any fine. And although he said nothing, his gaze left me with a tightness in my chest. If I had known what he knew. Later, I met Jake again at the city gas station. It was as if he was waiting for me, although he said he was just passing through. We talked for a few minutes until he finally mentioned Melody. He said he had seen her recently at the supermarket and that she seemed different. Dull was the word he used. I tried to laugh, saying she had always been more introspective, but he shook his head. It wasn't that. She was there, but she seemed not to be. Those words were etched in me, like an impossible whisper to forget. I insisted he explain better, but Jake changed the subject. He said he could be wrong, that maybe it was just an impression. But mothers don't ignore hunches. The image of my daughter with downcast eyes, walking among shelves as if carrying the world on her shoulders, tormented me the rest of the way. Melody was never expansive, it's true, but she was never indifferent to life. Something was wrong, I felt it in my bones. And that trip, which began with hope, now tasted of disquiet. It was the first time I heard the word apathy linked to my daughter. Melody offered no resistance when I pulled her inside. Her feet slid across the cold floor, and her eyes barely blinked. We went upstairs in silence, to the room where she used to sleep during visits. I took her to the bathroom, turned on the hot shower, and waited for the steam to fill the space. She looked at me lost before entering, and that broke me inside. I closed the door carefully and stayed outside for a few seconds, listening to the waterfall. When I felt she was calmer, I went to make the bed. I gently laid her down as soon as she came out of the shower, wrapped in a thick bathrobe with her hair still damp. Melody fell asleep quickly, like someone who had carried too much weight for too long. The silence of the room contrasted with the sounds coming from downstairs. I went downstairs with firm steps, my heart on alert, knowing I needed answers. I walked down the hallway until I approached the living room, where the voices seemed more relaxed, carefree. I didn't announce myself. I just stood there behind the wall listening. Something told me that this was the time to listen, not to speak. And I was right. A few seconds were enough for the facade to begin to crumble. Lucas spoke with irony, Evelyn with coldness. The words weren't whispers, they were statements. They believed what they were saying. My daughter was treated as an inconvenient presence, as if her fragility was a personal annoyance. My blood ran cold with every sentence. They didn't expect me to hear that. The voices took turns with cruel judgments. Evelyn said Melody was incapable of maintaining an image worthy of the Millers. So fragile, so sensitive. She's not fit to be one of us. Lucas agreed, laughing. She ruined the family name. Everything we built. The words sounded like knives twisting in my chest. It was as if they were talking about an employee who didn't live up to expectations. Not a wife, not a daughter. Amy, whom I had barely heard until then, commented something about how the followers would never know the truth if Melody simply disappeared for a while. As if my daughter's absence was more convenient than dealing with her pain. That went beyond contempt, it was inhumanity. I had never heard anything so cruel said with such naturalness. A theater of masks where my daughter was the target of humiliation. I felt my eyes well up, but I held back. That needed to be absorbed, recorded, exposed. It wasn't enough to be indignant, I needed to act. And at that moment I knew, they didn't see Melody as a person but as an obstacle. A piece that didn't fit into the perfect family image they built for others to see. My daughter was seen as a burden. With trembling hands, I took out my cell phone and started recording. The sound wasn't perfect, but every word recorded carried the weight of the truth. I remained motionless, fearing being discovered, until the voices began to disperse. I went upstairs slowly without making a sound, my heart still beating fast. Melody continued to sleep, oblivious to the poison that seeped through those walls. I approached her and held her hand carefully. My thoughts raced, but there was a spark of relief. I had something concrete. That recording might not heal my daughter, but it was a weapon against impunity. It was proof of what she had been silently enduring. Justice might ignore feelings, but words spoken by those cold lips, those could carry weight. Dawn arrived, dense and silent. I didn't know if I would be able to sleep, but I refused to leave her alone. I lay beside her, as I used to do when she was a child and dreamed of monsters. Now the monsters had names, surnames, and a well-decorated home. I closed my eyes with the decision made. This was just the beginning of the fight. If that wasn't enough to open the eyes of justice, I don't know what would be. The next day, I went after Jake without a second thought. I arranged to meet him at the Plaza Cafe, away from curious glances. I told him everything. What I saw, what I heard, the recording on my cell phone. His eyes changed as I narrated, from disbelief to contained indignation. When I finished, he was silent for a few seconds before speaking, as if weighing each word. Jake explained that while the recording might not be legally admissible in all cases, it could still help. He said the most important thing now was to protect Melody, emotionally and legally. There was no point in rushing to court unprepared, or we could lose everything. He advised me to seek a specialized lawyer, someone who understood the intricacies of psychological abuse. There were paths, but all required caution. He also added something that struck me. You're fighting an invisible war, Mary. But you're not alone. Those words gave me breath. For the first time since everything started, I felt like someone was on our side. The injustice was still there, cruel and concrete, but it no longer seemed invincible. With an ally on our side, I began to draw up a plan. There was still time to protect my daughter? Or was it too late? Melody woke up with heavy eyes, like someone returning from a very distant place. I sat beside her, stroking her hair as I did when she was little. She looked at me sadly and with a threat of a voice said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't want to ruin anyone's Thanksgiving." My heart broke once more. Instead of anger or revolt, what she felt was guilt. I tried to reassure her, saying she had done nothing wrong. But Melody looked away, fixing her gaze on an empty spot on the wall. His family. They just wanted peace and I keep causing trouble, she murmured. It was like hearing my daughter shrink inside, slowly fading away. She didn't see herself as a victim. She saw herself as an inconvenience. That was more painful than any phrase spoken by Evelyn or Lucas. I stayed there in silence for a few seconds, digesting what I had just heard. Jake's words echoed in my mind. Emotional abuse is invisible but real. Melody had been molded to believe she was always the problem. And the more she believed it, the more fragile she became. This hadn't happened overnight. It was the result of years of manipulation, control, and imposed silence. She had been taught to be silent. I took a deep breath before telling her my decision. I said I had already spoken with Jake and that I would look for a lawyer. She widened her eyes, sitting up in bed with effort. "Mom, please don't make a scene. It will pass. It always passes." Her reaction was a mixture of fear and despair, as if talking about justice would threaten the little stability she had left. But I could no longer pretend it was normal. I explained that this was not just about her. It was about all the women who had been silenced in the name of family harmony. I would not allow my daughter to be another statistic. Melody hesitated, looked down, and said nothing more. But at that moment I didn't need approval. I just needed courage. Hers would come with time, for now mine was enough. But I had already decided. I would no longer wait for her permission to save her. The office was cold and personal, full of stacked folders and diplomas on the walls. The lawyer Jake recommended was young, but direct. He listened attentively, taking notes until he sighed. Without legal proof, it will be difficult to move forward. I felt a tightening in my chest. That truth hit me like a wall. But then with hope in my hands, I took my cell phone from my bag. I showed him the recording, explained the circumstances in which I had captured everything. He put on headphones, listened to the end, and when he took his eyes off the device, there was something different in his gaze. "This changes the scenario," he said. "There may still be discussions about admissibility, but it's a start." For the first time, I saw a glimmer of possibility open up. It was the kind of proof that screamed what my daughter could never say. He suggested filing a petition for an initial hearing, something to serve as a warning. The idea was to shake things up, to let the Miller family know that we were no longer silent. I left that office with a divided heart, afraid of facing the system and relieved to finally be acting. The recording seemed like a powerful weapon. It was the key piece. Or so I thought. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined, but the weight of the atmosphere was suffocating. Lucas arrived in a dark suit, with downcast eyes and a rehearsed expression. Evelyn wore a discreet dress, holding a rosary and almost visible tears. Amy came smiling as if it were a gala event. Beside me, Melody trembled, but she was there, present. Her silence said much more than any scream. When the lawyers took their positions, I felt that it would not be simple. The Miller family's posture was one of total control. They greeted each other with restrained smiles, as if they were sure that everything would end as always, in their favor. When Lucas declared that he deeply regretted Melody's emotional state, I wanted to stand up and shout. But I remained motionless, holding her hand tightly. Their lawyer even had the audacity to suggest that the complaint was the result of maternal exaggeration and emotional interpretation of an upset lady. Evelyn lowered her head, feigning sadness. That act was an indecent spectacle. And the worst part, the judge watched everything with the impassivity of a statue, as if he needed even more compelling evidence to be moved. They were performing, and the audience was justice. When our lawyer presented the recording, my heart almost jumped out of my mouth. He explained the context, the relevance, the content. The judge asked for silence and listened to the excerpt in silence. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, he raised his eyes and declared, "Unfortunately, having been captured without consent, this recording is inadmissible at this time." The words echoed like gunshots inside me. Melody didn't even react. She just lowered her gaze. I tried to argue with my eyes, but it was too late. The decision was made. My biggest trump card had turned into nothing, and the disguised smiles on the other side of the room confirmed that they knew this from the beginning. The weight of frustration crushed me inside. I had the truth in my hands, but the truth alone was not enough. My greatest weapon had been destroyed before my eyes. After the hearing, I took Melody back home without saying a word. She looked out the window as if nothing else mattered. When we arrived, I sat beside her on the couch and wrapped her in a blanket, trying to provide comfort that I didn't even feel myself. "Sorry for everything, Mom," she whispered. I should have kept quiet. My heart ached in silence, but I continued to hold her hand. She turned her face to me, her eyes swollen and her voice almost gone. "I can't take it anymore." I took a deep breath, swallowing the panic rising in my throat. I said that this was not the end, that we would still fight. But Melody no longer seemed to believe in anything. She was exhausted from the pain, the exposure, the shame. The girl I raised seemed to be dissolving before my eyes. I touched her face and asked her to look at me. I said she wasn't weak, that her pain was real, and that no one had the right to say otherwise. She cried in silence like someone who had cried too much. And I, there powerless, had to accept that the wound was deeper than I imagined. She spoke of giving up everything. 2 days later, more devastating news came. The judge had decided that, until a new hearing, the custody of the couple's assets would remain with Lucas. This included the joint account, the house they lived in, and the car. Melody lost the right to access her own money. She didn't even react when she found out. She just lowered her head and said, "Of course. It was always his, even when it was in my name." I tried to understand the legal arguments, but everything seemed absurdly unfair. They said it was to avoid patrimonial conflicts. But what I saw was the system reinforcing the power of those who already dominated everything. My daughter was being stripped of any sense of autonomy. She wouldn't even have money to buy medicine, if it depended on justice. That outraged me as a mother but also as a woman. Every decision seemed like another push towards rock bottom. The Miller family watched from afar, maintaining the appearance of respect, but inside I knew they were savoring every small defeat of Melody. And the worst part was seeing that she herself was beginning to accept it as deserved. It was as if they had taken from her not only her possessions, but her very identity. They were taking everything from her, even her name. It was then that Jake appeared at home with a folder of documents. He said that, reviewing Melody's history and family statements, he found important loopholes. There was the basis for a new lawsuit, this time for emotional abuse. It's harder to prove, he warned, but it's a fairer path for what she went through. I felt my heart race. A new chance. He explained that we would need a psychological report, documented accounts, and patience. But it wasn't impossible. It was like opening a window in a suffocating room. When I told Melody, she just asked, "Will it take long?" I replied that yes, but that this time she wouldn't be alone. I saw a thread of hope in her eyes. Small but real. There was still a breach in the wall. In the days that followed, Jake and I spent hours analyzing every detail. He brought a spreadsheet with dates, recorded episodes, potential witnesses. It was a meticulous job, and each item was more painful than the last. Melody was still fragile, so we decided to spare her the full weight at that moment. But we knew that, sooner or later, she would have to face the past head-on. It was during one of these conversations in the late afternoon that we heard a scream coming from the bedroom. We ran and found Melody curled up on the floor, eyes wide, trying to control her breathing. I knelt beside her while Jake called a medical contact. She babbled disconnected phrases, but one name was repeated. Evelyn. The memory was stronger than she could contain. After a few minutes, we managed to calm her down. When she finally spoke clearly, she said that her mother-in-law used to lock the internal doors of the house so she wouldn't go out on those weekdays. It was control disguised as protection. An emotional prison. Melody had learned to be silent for survival. The marks Evelyn had left on her were not visible, but they were everywhere. Evelyn's voice echoed in her mind. The next day, Jake called me to talk privately. He said that, investigating more about Evelyn, he found 2 old reports registered at the police station. They were younger women who had worked as family caregivers. Both claimed to have suffered constant humiliation, veiled threats, and psychological manipulation. None took the case further, but the records were there, forgotten yet alive. He showed the documents calmly, like someone handing over something precious. "She's not just cruel, Mary. She's a repeat offender." My hands trembled as I held that evidence. The pattern was clear. Evelyn acted whenever she had someone more fragile under her influence. And silence was her most effective weapon. Melody was not the first. And if we didn't act, she wouldn't be the last. Rage took me strongly but soon gave way to urgency. Jake suggested we use these records to support the new lawsuit. They wouldn't be decisive alone, but added to Melody's accounts and our documents, they would create a consistent scenario. For the first time, it seemed that the truth could escape the labyrinth where Evelyn held it captive. It was a beginning. She was not just cruel, she was a repeat offender. With all this in hand, Jake scheduled a meeting with a lawyer specializing in emotional abuse cases. The office was in another city, away from judging eyes. Melody was reluctant but agreed to go, perhaps out of trust in Jake, perhaps out of exhaustion. During the conversation, she spoke little, but it was enough for the lawyer to understand the seriousness of the situation. He confirmed that there was a solid basis to open a new lawsuit. He explained that psychological abuse was harder to prove, but increasingly recognized in courts. He said it would be a long battle but not impossible. Melody listened in silence and at the end just whispered, "I'm in." That was more than consent, it was her first step. For the first time, I saw in her not only pain, but also the will to exist again. Jake left the room with a slight smile. "She's ready, Mary. Now it's up to us." I nodded, my heart racing. Yes, this time it was different. It was no longer about my indignation, nor just about my motherly impulse. This time the fight would be in her name, not just my pain. The invitation to the charity event arrived like a provocation. Evelyn would be honored for her dedication to family and community values. The hypocrisy of the title made me swallow hard, but I decided to go. Not as a spectator but as a mother. I wore the dress Melody had sewn years ago and walked with my head held high into the overly lit hall. I waited for the right moment. When Evelyn went on stage and began to thank everyone, I stood up from my chair and walked to the center of the hall. How many more women do you need to destroy to be considered a respectable lady? I asked in a firm voice. All eyes turned to me, and Evelyn froze for an instant. I continued. My daughter was one of many, and everyone here knows it. The tension could be cut with a knife. Evelyn tried to laugh, as if I were a bitter old woman making up stories. But no one laughed with her. I stood firm, enumerating episodes, citing dates, describing attitudes that many there had witnessed, but preferred to ignore. I spoke with pain but without fear. It was the truth that guided me at that moment. The hall fell silent. The attempted defense came soon after. Evelyn, with a trembling voice, said she had always acted for the good of the family, and that she never meant to hurt anyone. The audience, once so reverent, now murmured among themselves. A woman nearby commented, I remember when she humiliated her niece in public. A man shook his head, saying his wife had also been the target of cruel words. The mask began to unravel. Evelyn tried to compose herself, but her gestures no longer convinced. The image built over years was crumbling before watchful eyes and awakened memories. I didn't need to say anything else. The faces around me spoke for me. The shame she so avoided finally reached her. And there was no curtain to hide it. I saw something new in her eyes, hesitation. For the first time, Evelyn Miller had no answer. She quickly descended from the stage, ignoring the false applause of a few allies. But it was too late. The seed had been planted, and the truth spoken aloud. My heart raced, but there was a strange peace in me. For the first time she felt shame. The next day, Jake appeared with a folder in his hands and a determined look. Inside were tax documents, records of hidden assets, and indications of financial manipulation by the Miller family. Information that had been gathered in recent months, with the care and patience of someone who knew what they were doing. The time has come, he said. Now the system will have to listen. We took everything to the district attorney. The content was serious enough to open a new investigation. This time not only against Lucas, but also against Evelyn. The record showed a pattern of control and abuse that went beyond the domestic sphere. It was a system sustained by fear and silence, and now it was beginning to crumble. When I told Melody, she just closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Thank you for not giving up on me, she whispered. And I knew that every step until then had been worth it. What once seemed untouchable now trembled at its foundations. No one there would escape immune. It was late afternoon when I heard the doorbell. I went to the door cautiously, but when I opened it I was startled. It was Noah. He was alone, wearing a thick coat and a look that mixed guilt and urgency. Can I talk to her? He asked. I hesitated for a second, but Melody, who had heard his voice, appeared behind me. He stepped forward and said, I needed to see you. And apologize. Melody didn't answer immediately. She just looked at him, as if she no longer knew who he was. They went into the living room, sat in silence until Noah spoke. I never agreed with what they did to you, but I also never had the courage to stop it. The sincerity in his voice was unexpected. I want to help. If you allow me, I want to testify on your behalf. It was then that I realized. He had been watching longer than we imagined. He knew more than he let on. Perhaps his neutrality was a form of defense, but now it had given way. Noah no longer seemed like a man trapped by family loyalty. He seemed like someone trying to do what was right, even if it was too late. He saw more than he showed. The two talked for hours. Melody, in a low, slow voice, began to share memories she had never even told me. She recounted that Evelyn would lock her room when visitors came, saying that her fragility spoiled the mood. She revealed that at some parties she was forbidden from leaving her room, so as not to embarrass the guests. And that Lucas said she was better off silent, like a real lady. Noah listened in silence, his face contorted in shame and regret. When Melody told him about the Christmas when Evelyn hid her medication, implying she needed to learn to live without crutches. His eyes filled with tears. She said, her voice choked. She made me feel like a mistake, as if I was born wrong. I had to leave the room for a few minutes to breathe. Seeing Melody relive all that tore me apart, but at the same time it was liberating. For the first time she was being heard without judgment. Noah did not interrupt, did not explain, did not doubt. He just listened with the weight of someone who knew that his omission had cost a lot. And even in silence, Melody seemed to feel that, there she was no longer alone. She made me feel like a mistake, Melody said. That night, Noah called me into the kitchen while Melody rested. He said he could no longer pretend not to see. They always controlled me, Mary. But now I see. He pulled out his cell phone and showed messages, audios, evidence he had been gathering. I want to be a witness. I want justice to know what they did to her. That was more than courage. It was a rupture. We called the lawyer immediately. He confirmed that Noah's testimony could be a game-changer in the process. He was the first member of the Miller family to take a public stand. The impact would be immense. And more. It would provide legal backing for the reconstruction of everything they tried to deny. Noah did not hesitate, nor did he ask for anonymity. He was determined. The Miller family's wall of silence had begun to crumble. The courtroom was packed. Cameras positioned in every corner. Journalists whispering among themselves, as if it were a spectacle. Melody, beside me, kept her gaze down, but her hand was firmly intertwined with mine. On the other side, Evelyn displayed a discreet smile, and Lucas wore an impeccable suit. They seemed confident, as if nothing could touch them. It was the perfect image they always wanted to maintain. Evelyn exchanged smiles with acquaintances from the city, and Lucas even greeted the judge with false cordiality. The staging began even before the trial. I saw their lawyer whisper something and they laughed discreetly. But on our side we were ready. The truth finally would have a voice. And it would no longer be silenced. When the judge entered, everyone stood up. Silence fell like a heavy cloak over the room. I felt my heart beat to the rhythm of destiny approaching. Melody squeezed my hand and whispered, "It will end, Mom." And I believed her. Because that day we were no longer isolated. We had witnesses, documents, courage. And above all, we had the truth. They still thought they would win by their last name. The moment for Noah's testimony arrived. He walked to the center of the room with firm steps and a determined expression. No one seemed to expect it. From the defendant's bench, Evelyn lost her smile. Noah looked directly at the judge and began to speak, without hesitation. He recounted the episodes he witnessed, the veiled abuses, the forced silences. He spoke about the psychological control, about the constant fear imposed on Melody, about the social punishments Evelyn applied when someone didn't obey. He cited dates, locations, specific phrases. He brought evidence, showed messages, exposed the farce that the family had tried so hard to preserve. Every word was a brick pulled from the castle of appearances they had built. And no one dared to interrupt him. When he finished, the room was in shock. The judge asked a few questions, and Noah answered with the same firmness. Evelyn's lawyer tried to disqualify him, but there was no room for doubt. He looked at Melody and said, "My family failed her. But today I'm here to do what's right." Murmurs began among those present. And this time they weren't laughter. "My family failed her," he said before everyone. After hearing the final arguments, the judge retired to deliberate. The minutes seemed like hours, but when he returned, the verdict was clear. He ordered compensation for moral and emotional damages in favor of Melody. More than that, he ordered the formal opening of an investigation into Evelyn for recurrent psychological abuse. The room erupted in murmurs and astonishment. On the other side, faces paled. Melody didn't cry. She just closed her eyes for a few seconds, as if she wanted to store that moment deep in her soul. Then she raised her face, took a deep breath, and faced the judge with dignity. I held her hand, feeling an emotion impossible to describe. She had been heard, rescued, respected. For the first time, I saw my daughter lift her face with dignity. The days that followed the trial were not filled with euphoria, but with silence. A different silence from the one that haunted us for so long. It was a silence of peace, of new beginnings. Melody spent weeks still withdrawn, trying to understand who she was without the weight of guilt, without constant fear. But little by little, the light returned to her eyes, and that was the greatest gift life gave me. Today she still faces difficult days. The pain doesn't disappear like magic, but it no longer dictates the course of her choices. She resumed therapy, started writing in her notebook again, and even began to tend a small garden in the backyard. Every flower that blooms there seems to carry something that was once denied to her: time, care, and space to exist. Noah remained firm in his decision to break with the family. He moved to another city and became a discreet, but constant supporter. Jake continues to be our ally, now a family friend. Someone whom pain united but truth sealed. Evelyn, in turn, reaps the consequences of what she sowed. And for the first time, she cannot hide what she always was behind smiles. As for me, I continue to be a mother. But I also learned to be a complete woman. Someone who speaks, who acts, and who no longer waits for the right moment to defend those she loves. I wasn't a heroine. I was human. And if my story touched you, may it serve as a warning, as strength, as a memory. Because no daughter should freeze outside, while others pretend that's normal. Now, I'm curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Have you experienced something similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I'm leaving another story on the final screen that you'll also like, and it will definitely surprise you. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.